Je suis donc ravie de vous accueillir, pour
I
la
am
suite
pleased to
et
welcome
la
you
fin
back
de
to
ce
the
forum, franco-allemand, de l'énergie
final
en ligne. Nous
chapter in
allons
this
reprendre beaucoup des
Franco-German
sujets qui ont été
dialogue
abordés,
online.
depuis
We
le
have
début
quite
de
a
la
number of
matinée
topics
à
that we've
travers
touched
une table
upon
ronde, et
since
ce
starting off or
trilemme
kicking off this morning.
énergétique et transition
Now we will look at
énergétique,
the energy
assurer la
trilemma
sécurité
and the energy
d'approvisionnement, la
transition,
rentabilité
as well
et
as
la durabilité
ensuring
en
security
France
of
et en
supply,
Allemagne. Sur
profitability,
la
and
voie vers la
sustainability in
neutralité,
France and Germany
climatique, nous allons voir
on the
comment
road
nous
to
pouvons
climate
arriver,
neutrality.
à un bon
And
équilibre
I
pour la
think
conception de
that
ce futur marché, de
we will
l'électricité, hein. Je rappelle que c'est
soon
l'été
achieve
dernier
a good
que le règlement
balancing
et
and
la
calibration
directive
of this
révisée sur la
path towards
conception
the
de ce
future.
marché sont
And
entrés en vigueur,
this
introduisant
in
une
France
série
already,
de nouvelles
this has
dispositions
already
pour mieux réguler,
come
le
into
prix de
force with
l'énergie et
new
accélérer
provisions
notamment le déploiement de
in
la
order
flexibilité.
to,
Le texte fixe des délais aux
yes,
États membres pour mettre
accelerate
en
also
œuvre au
flexibility.
mieux
There
ces
are certain
propositions. Nous allons voir,
deadlines in order
à
to
travers, la
implement
table ronde, les
these
attentes
points.
d'acteurs, hein,
We
de
will now
l'énergie dans
turn to a
plusieurs secteurs,
roundtable.
sur ce sujet-là. Vous pouvez,
Protagonists in different
également
areas of
préparer,
the
vos
energy
questions
sector.
que nous
And
transmettrons,
we will
à
then,
la
of
fin
course,
à nos
also put your
intervenants.
questions
Je
to
vais
them.
donc leur passer la
I would
parole.
now like
Vous
to
pourrez,
hand
chacun
them the
en
floor,
quelques
and
mots,
each one of you,
vous
perhaps,
présenter.
maybe
Anna
you
Bourgui,
can
bonjour.
introduce
Vous
yourselves
êtes chef d'équipe
briefly.
Affaires
Anna Bourgui,
européennes au
you
sein
are
de
head of the
Transnet
European Affairs
BW.
team, Transnet
Pouvez-vous, là encore, en
BW,
quelques mots, c'est important que
maybe,
chacun
and
des acteurs puisse se
it's important
présenter,
that
qu'on
each
comprenne
one of the
bien un peu ce que
participants,
vous faites dans
or
l'énergie.
that
Je terminerai
everybody really
évidemment avec vous,
understands
dans
exactly
les réseaux dont
what
on va
your
beaucoup
area of
parler.
activity is. Your area of activity is the network, the grid. We've talked at length about it. Maybe you can expand.
Ja, vielen Dank.
Thank you
Danke
very
für die
much.
Einladung,
Thank you
spannende
for the
Diskussionen.
invitation.
Ich bin
Very
Anna
interesting
Burgi und leite
topics. My
das
name is Anna
Team
Borgi,
European Affairs bei der
and I'm
EnBW.
the team leader
Transnet
of
BW
European
ist
Affairs at
unser
the Transnet
Transnetbetreiber für
BW.
Strom.
We are the
Einer davon sitzt in
transmission
Deutschland. Wir sagen, wir sind im Herzen
operators
Europas, da
for
durch
one of the
unsere
regions of Germany. We're
geografische
really
Lage
in the
sehr
heart of
zentral in
Europe,
Europa
and
ist. Deshalb
geographically
sehen wir
speaking,
uns als eine wichtige
and
Teil
therefore
der
we do
Energiewende für
understand
dem
ourselves as being
Energiesystem Europas
part,
und
an
auch
important player in the
die
energy
Schienenverbindung von
system,
Deutschland und Frankreich.
also in the connection between Germany and France.
Merci beaucoup à vous pour,
Thank you
cette
very much
présentation.
for
Évidemment,
this
vous allez,
presentation
intervenir, sur ces
and
sujets,
introduction.
dans un
Obviously, you
instant.
will be
Également, pour intervenir,
getting back to the
Olivier
topic
Varnan. Merci
shortly.
beaucoup,
Now I'd
Olivier,
like
avec qui
to
vous êtes
turn
partenaire
to
au
Olivier
sein de
Varnon.
BNP Paribas
You are
Asset Management. Vous
partner
allez
at
nous expliquer,
BNP
comment vous
Paribas,
investissez aussi, dans ce
and
secteur
you
et
will
votre point de vue. Quelques
uh,
mots pour vous présenter.
explain to us how you are
Volontiers.
involved in
Merci
this
beaucoup
sector and what your
de m'avoir
perspective is.
invité.
Yes,
Je suis
thank you
ravi
very
d'être
much for
là.
the
Donc
invitation.
effectivement, je m'occupe chez
So
BNP
indeed,
Paribas Asset Management d'un
at
fonds d'investissement
Paribas,
capital risque
I
qui
am
investit au capital de
the
start-up
head of
dans la
a
transition
investment
écologique
fund
en Europe et aux
based on
États-Unis.
VC capital
C'est une activité
and
que nous avons commencée il y a
focusing on
8 ans.
Europe.
Et à l'époque,
We
nous
started
faisions pour le compte
8 years
propre de la
ago, and
banque.
at the
BNP
time we
Paribas
worked
avait pris
for the
l'engagement au moment
bank
de la COP21 de
because,
soutenir
or
l'innovation dans
on
la
behalf
transition
also of the bank,
énergétique
because
en allouant 100 millions d'euros de son fonds
BNP
d'argent
Paribas had
pour de
actually
l'investissement au
pledged
capital
100
de
million of their
start-up
own
innovantes.
funds
Et il y a
within the
2
framework
ans,
of the Paris
nous sommes
Agreement in
associés
order
avec la Fondation
to move on that
Solarity
path
de
towards
Bertrand Picard
decarbonization.
pour lancer un fonds d'investissement
And
ouvert à toutes
Bertrand
les
Ricard then
entreprises
asked us
immobilières et à des
to set up
investisseurs
an
tiers.
investment fund
C'est ainsi que notre fonds,
open
qui
to
cumule
investors. And
172 millions d'euros, est
in this
soutenu
case, we
à
have
moitié par BNP Paribas
172
et l'autre
million
moitié par
euros,
des investisseurs,
half of it
principalement
being
institutionnels.
subscribed by
Donc vous l'aurez
Banque
compris, je ne
Paribas
suis
and the
pas un
other
spécialiste
by
des marchés de
institutional
l'électricité,
investors. So
mais
I'm
j'espère
not an
pouvoir
expert on
apporter un éclairage
electricity market,
différent
but I do
avec
hope that
l'angle
I
des
can
investisseurs et des
yes, bring to
start-up.
bear a different vantage point,
C'est
the
justement ce
perspective of
que nous vous
investors.
demandons, pas nécessairement d'être,
Well,
expert du
certainly
marché de
that is
l'énergie,
what
mais
we're looking
d'avoir,
forward
comme
to.
je le
We don't.
disais en introduction, des points de
It's
vue
not about being an
différents.
expert in
On a
energy
justement
markets.
beaucoup
We want to
parlé,
have
des
different points of
industriels,
view.
du rôle des industriels, donc
We
on est
speak.
ravis
We'll have
d'accueillir
to speak a
Éric
lot
Laming,
about
qui est donc,
industrials and
chef des affaires
industrialists and
gouvernementales et réglementaires
the
au sein de
role of
ThyssenKrupp
industries.
Steel.
And
Nous
therefore, I'd
allons
like
passer en
to
quelques mots pour, vous
welcome
présenter
Corinna
et
Grajecki,
présenter,
who is
votre groupe, Madame Mink.
Erika Mink-Zagul, head of the Government and Regulatory Affairs at ThyssenKrupp
Ja,
Steel.
ganz herzlichen Dank
Yes,
für die
thank you very
Einladung.
much. Thank you for the invitation.
Energiepreise ist für
Energy,
uns
energy
ein ganz, ganz
prices,
zentrales Thema, ist
that's a
wirklich
very
ein für uns als Stahlunternehmen, wir sind das
important topic
größte
for us as a steel
Stahlwerk
company. We are
Europas.
the
Wir
largest
begleiten den
steel
Bereich
producer in
der
Europe.
Politik
and I'm the head of the
ganz große Transformation vor der Brust.
political
Wir müssen also
relations
jetzt und wollen auch
department,
von einer
policies
kohlebasierten
department.
Stahlproduktion
We want to
komplett neuen
move from a
Stahlwerk bauen,
coal-based
die wir in
production
Zukunft
away
klimaneutral
towards
arbeiten können, die auf
new
Wasserstoff
production sites based on
basiert sind. Wir
hydrogen that
ersetzen also Kohle
can
durch
produce
Wasserstoff,
steel
durch
in a
grünen
climate
Wasserstoff.
neutral way.
Wir
We're
werden von
replacing
einem
coal by green
von
or
einem
with
Unternehmen,
green
was
hydrogen.
Strom heute größtenteils
We
eigenproduziert,
are
den werden wir in der Zukunft extern
currently
beziehen müssen im
company that
Rahmen dieses
produces its own power,
Technologiewechsels.
and we
Wird sich
will
also ganz viel
shift
für uns
towards
verändern.
a mode
Deshalb
where
sind
we
die
will
Themen,
purchase more power.
die Sie heute
That
hier
means that we
diskutieren, existenzieller
are looking at
Bedeutung.
topics that are being
Und ich
debated here
bin
that are
sehr
really
froh, dass
existential
ich so
to
uns
us,
die
have
Perspektive
existential
eines
significance. And
energieintensiven
I'm very
Unternehmens hier
pleased to
beitragen zu
provide
können. Dankeschön.
the point of view of an energy-intensive industry in this context.
Merci à vous. Je vais vous faire
Thank you.
intervenir dans un instant justement sur la
It will
problématique
be your
des
turn,
prix de
obviously,
l'énergie dont vous allez
when we
parler. Je vais
look at
présenter
the
notre
energy
quatrième
price
intervenante,
issue.
Corina
But I'd like to
Gajewski. Merci beaucoup
introduce
d'être
our
avec nous,
fourth speaker,
directrice
Corina
des affaires
Gajewski,
européennes chez
Director of
Engie.
European Affairs
Là
at
encore, si vous le
Engie.
souhaitez, évidemment, quelques mots
And
pour
obviously,
présenter Engie pour ceux qui ne le
you
connaîtraient
have the
pas
floor
encore. En
now
tout cas, mieux
to
connaître
introduce
aussi
yourselves in
la
Engie,
problématique pour votre entreprise. Merci.
but perhaps also what the situation for your company is.
Merci beaucoup pour
Thank
cette
you very
invitation
much for
tout
this
d'abord. Donc,
invitation.
la coopération franco-allemande
The
me tient vraiment à
Franco-German
cœur, très
cooperation is very
personnellement.
important to me,
Ayant
also at a
grandi
personal
en
level.
Allemagne, ayant vécu à
And
Paris, et
I have
travaillant
lived in
à
Paris
Bruxelles sur les affaires
and
européennes. Donc
and
vraiment
worked in
ravi
Brussels on
d'être
European
avec vous et de
affairs based in
discuter
Germany. I'm
d'un
very,
point de
very
vue
pleased to join
franco-allemand.
this
Le
debate
groupe
on
Engie, c'est un groupe
Franco-German
mondial de
cooperation.
l'énergie bas
Engie
carbone
is a
qui est
global
aujourd'hui présent dans
energy
beaucoup de pays
company
dans le monde, mais surtout
present in many
d'origine
countries,
française et très
but
ancrée
has its
en
roots in
Europe,
France,
présent
but
dans 9
has
États
very much
membres.
a European
Et pour nous,
identity,
la
present in
transition
9
énergétique,
member
c'est bien
states.
sûr
For us, the energy
notre métier,
transition
c'est au
is
cœur de notre
really
business. Et nous avons comme
our
ambition
core
de
business,
devenir
and we have the
net
ambition
zéro en 2045.
to achieve net
Et
zero
nous
in
travaillons
2045.
beaucoup sur le sujet
And
de
therefore,
comment
we
faire la
work
transition
assiduously on this
énergétique
topic of achieving energy
aussi
transition
abordable en termes de
and to
prix
make it
que
as
possible,
affordable as possible
sans réduire
in terms of
l'ambition
pricing
de cette
without
transition
reducing
énergétique qui est tellement
the core
importante pour
ambition of
l'Europe
this energy
et aussi
transition,
en
which is
termes
so
de
important for Europe.
compétitivité industrielle.
Also, when it comes to the, or with regards
Merci
to the
beaucoup à tous les
competitiveness
quatre
of
pour cette
European
première prise
industries.
de
Thank you
table. Vous
very
avez
much to all four
justement
of you
parlé
for
de
this
compétitivité, vous avez parlé
introduction.
de
You've spoken
l'industrie. Donc,
about
pour débuter la table
competitiveness, you've
ronde, je vais
spoken about the
repasser la
industries, and
parole
therefore
à
I'd like
Erika
to
Mink, qui
now
l'a dit d'ailleurs dans
move
son
back to Erika
introduction.
Mink,
Les
who
prix de
in
l'énergie sont
her
évidemment sont
introduction
trop hauts quand on est un
mentioned that
acteur
the energy
industriel
prices are too
comme
high.
vous. La réforme
Certainly,
du
when it
design
comes
du
to an
marché de
industrial player
l'électricité, c'est
like you, the
important parce
design
qu'on
of
a
the
besoin de prix
electricity market is
abordables,
very important because you
d'assurer des
need an
signaux
affordable
de
price.
prix adéquats.
You need
Quelle
to
est
make sure that the right
votre
price
problématique?
signals take place. So what are the issues for you?
Ja, also wie gesagt, wir sind ein
As I
energieintensives
mentioned, we are
Unternehmen.
an energy-intensive
Stahlproduktion ist
company.
energieintensiv.
Steel production
Wir haben
is an
bisher als ältestes
energy-intensive
Stahlwerk haben wir eben
activity.
unseren Strom selber
Next to our
produziert und die
steel
Abgase
mills,
aus unseren
we
bisherigen
produce
Prozessen.
our own
So
energy
dieses
through
ganze Setup
the
wird sich ändern, indem wir
residual oils of our own
dekarbonisieren. Wir haben
processes.
also
So
eine
we are
3
decarbonizing this
Milliarden
process.
Investment
We are
Entscheidung
looking at a
in eine
3
sogenannte
billion investment
Reduktionsanlage. Das
decision
ist die
in
neue
order to set up a
Technologie, die wir dann auf
reduction
Wasserstoff betreiben
facility, a
werden.
new technology
Damit
that
können
will
wir schon ein
be
Viertel
operating on the basis of hydrogen, and a quarter of our production can thus be shifted to this new technology. But in turn, this also means a high energy consumption. The new technology needs a lot of energy as well, and we also have a demand in terms of hydrogen, volumes of hydrogen, in order to operate this installation. So the demand that we have will actually increase sixfold. That is massive. At the same time, we're also facing a very strong and very stiff international competition with other regions, such as the United States, and even more so with China. We have energy prices that are twice or even 3 times as high as in other regions of the world. So that further increase and the current development would lead us to be, yes, to lose our competitiveness. And another important figure, if you look at today's conventional steel production and the share of energy costs and electricity prices, power prices, a share of our power basis product, which is the first product that emerges from production, 45%, and in the future we will have up to 50% of energy costs that will be part of this overall product cost, meaning that we need a reduction of costs. What we're currently witnessing, and we're focusing really on the grid charges right now, grid charges represent almost 50% of our energy prices. So that what we have to say is that we expect very drastic steps and measures adopted by the government, but also within the framework of the Clean Investment Deal of the European Commission, where, I mean, the situation has been recognized. We have the Draghi report, which also focuses on the energy topics and energy-intensive industries, so that we are hopeful that we will come to good solutions, but also that they're implemented quickly. For us, the first and foremost priority is to lower the grid fees, and we need to see what financing mechanisms could be put in place, but at the same time, energy supply is also a very, yes, a basic supply, a basic requirement as well, and therefore we need state regulatory interventions to make sure that competitiveness is guaranteed in pricing. Yes, we'll come back to some of these levers that you've just underscored. You spoke of this particular point of reducing grid fees, and therefore I'd like to hand the floor to Anna Borghi so that she could start exploring this topic of grid fees that we've been touching on frequently during this day, with a particular focus perhaps also on the situation in Germany. Anna Borghi, please.
Ja, also wir haben viel über
Indeed,
Versorgungssicherheit auch jetzt gehört.
we heard a lot about
Ich denke, dass
supply
in der
security,
Vergangenheit Versorgungssicherheit
and I do
wurde
believe that in
als
the past,
selbstverständlich
supply security was seen as something that goes without saying.
Und die Energiewende
And
bringt mit
the
sich
energy transition, the
diese
changes,
Wechsel, dass wir
bring
müssen
about
mehr Fokus auf
a shift, and we need
Versorgungssicherheit
to focus much more on supply security.
Bisher hat die
And
Politik und die Ziele viel
to
Fokus
date,
auf erneuerbaren Energien und die
politicians and decision makers have focused
gesehen, was
very
wichtig
much on
ist,
renewable energies,
wobei die
which is very
Netze
important.
sind, was erneuerbare
But
Energien
the
und
grids, when it
Versorgungssicherheit
comes
nicht
to
verbinden
renewables
Das heißt, wir brauchen die Netze,
and supply security are absolutely vital. So we need the grids in order to transport the energy and the electricity
die
where it is needed.
wir im Moment sehen, ist, dass die
Therefore, we
Sequenz
see
der
this
Energiewende
difficulty
wurde anders gedacht, als
that
vielleicht wir denken
the
können.
sequence of
Also
events
die
perhaps has
Einsparungen,
been
die wir für die Netze
seen
brauchen,
somewhat
sind
different
viel
than we
länger
actually
als
need. The
die
time that we
von
need for the
erneuerbaren
grids and for
Energien.
adapting the grids is much longer than for setting up renewable energy generation. So as grid operators, we look at all the opportunities that exist to optimize the situation and to bring, and something that can bring about changes are ground-based cables, for example, and if we have direct current connections as overhead lines, then we could actually save up to 20 billion euro. Well, that would be one example that we propose as a solution in order to keep costs in check. But we also have other solutions that are connected to the market. For example, dispatchable energy platforms that we operate together with other operators in Europe. For example, the Picasso platform, where in 2024 alone, we worked with few countries and achieved a 180 million euro profit. So we're trying to look at solutions that bring about cost optimization together with others and allow us at the same time to obtain our objectives.
Voilà, on voit que des solutions se mettent progressivement en place pour réduire ces coûts parce que c'est un
So we can
enjeu
see
important.
that
Puisqu'on parle
solutions
aussi de
are
prix
emerging to cut
de
costs. We
prix
talked about
abordables,
predictable and
on parlait
affordable
des
prices, and we can
mécanismes
also
de
talk
soutien,
about
on en a parlé
support
déjà dans la
mechanisms.
journée, comme les
They've been
CFD
mentioned
ou les
repeatedly
PPA,
throughout the day, as well
dans
as
un contexte
PPAs
où
and
les prix
CFDs,
marchés sont de plus en plus
in a
bas ou plus
context in which
négatifs en
market
raison
prices
d'un
are very
développement
low
des
and may even be
renouvelables.
negative
Quel est votre point de vue
due to
justement
renewable
sur ce
energies. So
déploiement
what's your view
et la
on
facilitation des
using
CFD et des
those,
PPA quand on a un
facilitating
projet de ski?
PPAs and CFDs? Karina, what do you think?
Merci beaucoup, Nathalie. Oui, effectivement,
Yes,
j'aimerais
thank you.
peut-être commencer par dire que il
Perhaps I
faut,
could say, first of all,
par principe et de manière générale,
that generally
il
speaking,
faut toutes les technologies et tous les vecteurs de la
and as a general
décarbonation.
rule,
Ça,
we
c'est
need to
très,
use
très
all
clair pour nous qui
technologies
sommes
and all
vraiment
forms of
au
energy
sein
for
d'Engie, en fait,
decarbonisation. In Engie,
neutre
we're a
en termes
group
de
which
technologie,
is
ou autrement dit, on a
technology
toutes les
neutral.
technologies
In other words, we
déjà
work
en
with
Europe
all
ou dans le
the
monde.
potential
Donc,
technologies
on
in
connaît et
Europe
on
and around the
reconnaît
world.
tous les bénéfices de
We
chacune
recognize
de ces
that
technologies.
all of these technologies have their
Mais
strengths.
une chose est claire aussi, effectivement, que
There is, however, one
les
thing that's crystal
renouvelables et le
clear.
déploiement rapide des énergies
Renewables
renouvelables
and
est
rapid
une
rollout
option non
of
regrettable,
renewable
à notre avis. C'est-à-dire
technologies is
qu'il est effectivement
absolutely
très
crucial.
important de continuer à travailler sur ce
It's very important
déploiement
that we continue to work
rapide
on rapid deployment.
et optimisé en termes de coûts.
And we need to optimize that in cost
Pour
terms as well.
cela, nous pensons que la réforme du market
To
design
that
au
end,
niveau européen
reform of
est
electricity
aussi
market
un
design
sens
at the
qu'elle
European
a
level
mis
is
beaucoup
a
d'accent
success in
sur
as much as
les
it's really
mécanismes
placed
et
an
les instruments
emphasis
de long terme.
on
C'est-à-dire notamment ce que vous
long-term
avez mentionné,
mechanisms and
les
instruments,
PPA et les
PPAs, as you
CFD.
mentioned, and contracts for
Il y a
difference.
aussi le volet mécanisme de capacité dont
There's
on a
also
déjà parlé.
capacity mechanisms that we talked
Pour les
about
PPA
earlier.
et les
As far as the
CFD, il
PPA and the
faut
CFDs go,
bien distinguer les deux
we
parce
need
que
to
les
draw a clear
PPA
distinction between
sont
the two. The PPAs
des contrats négociés
are
entre deux
contracts
contreparties privées.
negotiated
Et
between
je souligne ce
two
point parce que
private sector parties. And I
lorsque dans les
underline that because I
discussions
see that in the
européennes,
discussion at European
que
level,
parfois
that
il y a un peu
on occasion,
le souhait de
there
plus
is
réglementer
a
ces
desire
PPA.
to have greater
Alors que
regulation of the
comme ce sont
PPAs,
des
although
contrats
actually,
entre deux contreparties
as
privées,
these are
ça me
contracts between
semble
two
pas la
private
meilleure
sector
idée,
parties, we
mais
think that's
plutôt
not
de
the
veiller
best way
à
to
ce
approach
qu'il y
this.
a
It'd be a better idea
à ce que
to
tous
take
les
steps to
obstacles, par
ensure
exemple,
that all
sur
of the potential obstacles
la négociation et
pertaining to negotiation
l'établissement de PPA
and to establishment of PPA,
au-delà des frontières nationales
when you're looking at a
pourront
cross-border
suffire.
context, could
Donc,
actually
plutôt
be overcome.
déréglementer
So what I'm trying to say is that it's important to get rid of
et ne
red
pas
tape
revenir sur l'idée même d'un PPA
rather than calling into
contrat
question the
privé.
idea of the
Et pour les
PPA as a private
CFD,
sector contract. As to CFDs,
effectivement,
contracts for
il
difference,
faut les utiliser. Le two-sided CFD
the
qui a
two-sided
été
CFDs
introduit
should be
avec la réforme
utilized.
doit
They
se
were
mettre en
introduced with
place.
the reform,
Et d'ailleurs, on peut très bien combiner les deux instruments. Il
and
peut
it's
y avoir
actually
des
a
projets
good
avec
idea
un
to
volet
combine the two.
CFD
You can have
et un volet
projects where you have
PPA.
on the one hand a
Et
PPA side
c'est
of
très
things,
bien
and on the
pour
other
le
hand a
développement
CFD.
du
That's very
marché.
positive for market
Par ailleurs,
development.
pour le déploiement des renouvelables, il y
Furthermore,
a
when it
tout
comes to rollout of
ce qui a déjà
renewables,
été dit par Anna sur
Anna's
les
already said
questions
a great deal
d'infrastructure. Donc, il
about
faut
infrastructure
avoir
issues. There's enormous need to develop infrastructure very rapidly.
Le déploiement des renouvelables à tous les niveaux,
We need to
c'est-à-dire
bring forward
transmission, comme
deployment of
l'indiquait Alain, mais
renewables as
aussi
soon
au
as
niveau de la
possible
distribution et bien sûr au
in
niveau
terms
des
of distribution,
interconnexions
for
entre les
example,
pays
and
européens.
also cross-border
Peut-être un dernier
interconnections
point
as
sur
well.
les
One last
renouvelables,
point,
il
if I
faut
may,
bien
on
sûr
renewables.
toujours mentionner la thématique du permitting, les autorisations de projets. L'Union
Permits are
européenne a
always
fait beaucoup d'efforts
a key
pour
topic. The
réduire
European Union has done a
le
great
temps de
deal
permitting, la
to
complexité
ensure
administrative et
that the
bureaucratique
timeline can be speeded
des
up
autorisations.
and that it's possible
Il y a
to
des provisions
cut
très
back
favorables
on
dans la
red tape.
directive
In the
sur les
directive
énergies renouvelables,
on renewable
mais qui ne
energies,
sont
there's
pas appliquées
excellent
partout
provisions, but they're
et de
not
la même
applied
façon.
everywhere.
Donc là,
And they're not
c'est
applied the
vraiment un
same
point,
way across the
là
board
encore,
either.
une option
That's one
no
major
regrets.
concern. A no
Évidemment,
regrets option
encore réduire les
would help
obstacles
to
bureaucratiques
overcome some of the
et faire le
bureaucratic
permitting
hurdles.
encore plus
And that
rapide.
would mean that approval
L'Allemagne
and
a
permits
beaucoup
could be
avancé sur ce
organised much more
sujet et
rapidly.
il
Germany's
faudrait
made
que
a lot of
ça
headway on
continue et
this
que ça accélère
and must continue to
un
do
peu
so.
partout en Europe.
The pace needs to speed up on this
Voilà,
right
je m'arrête
across
là
Europe.
pour les
That's
renouvelables.
that for the time being for renewables.
Mais
Thank
c'est
you.
important de souligner ces
Yes,
différents
but it's
points et
important to
d'ailleurs
underline these
certains
various
intervenants
points.
pourront réagir, mais je n'oublie
And the
pas
other speakers could
Olivier Vernon
respond as
pour
well. And
commenter. Vous pouvez réagir aussi à ce
Olivier
qui a été
Vernon,
dit depuis le
you
début
can
de la
respond as well
commission.
to what's been said
Et on
right
l'a beaucoup
since the
dit, le
start of
développement
the
des
round
énergies
table.
renouvelables
We
signifie
heard a
une
great deal about development
flexibilité du
of
système
renewables,
électrique
meaning that
qui est aussi un peu
flexibility of the
développée.
electrical system
Qu'est-ce que
needs
vous
to be
observez du côté des
fine-tuned
enjeux
as
de
well.
flexibilité? Et vous
What's your
pouvez
view
répondre aussi
on
à
this, on
d'autres points
flexibility,
si
and
vous le
also on
souhaitez
other
qui ont
points that
été
have been raised if you
soulevés.
so desire?
Sur la flexibilité, effectivement, c'est un sujet qu'on regarde depuis
As to
maintenant
flexibility,
8 ans. Je crois que notre
we've been
premier
looking into that
investissement dans les
for
smart grids,
8 years now. I think the first
ça date à peu
investment
près
in
de
smart
cette
grids
époque-là.
is from around
Et
about
on
that
voit
time
quand même un
period.
certain nombre d'obstacles.
There are a number
Alors
of
aujourd'hui,
obstacles at present.
vu le public, j'ai envie de dire,
Given
un des
the
obstacles,
audience,
c'est
I would
le
say that
le
one of the
marché
obstacles
européen,
is, of
c'est-à-dire que
course,
chaque acteur est très
the way
dépendant de
in
son
which
marché local.
the
Et donc, c'est vrai que pour des
European
startups, c'est
market is
compliqué parce
structured.
que
Startups
parfois le
tend to
marché
focus on
domestique
their
n'est pas
local markets.
suffisant
Sometimes the domestic market is
pour
not
faire la croissance qui est
large
attendue là.
enough to
Et
have the
donc ça,
requisite
c'est un
growth.
obstacle. Et puis on a vu
That's one
aussi
obstacle.
beaucoup de volatilité
Furthermore, there's a great
dans ces
deal of
marchés-là,
volatility in these
au gré des
markets
décisions politiques.
as
Et
a
donc un marché qui
function of
était
political
très
decisions.
rémunérateur du jour au lendemain, c'est vu
So there
complètement
might be a
fermé.
market which was
On l'a
very
vu au
profitable, which
UK, on
from
l'a vu
one
dans
day to
d'autres
the next
pays
just
en
closed up. That was the
Scandinavie.
case
Et donc
in
c'est
the
extrêmement
UK
compliqué
and
pour
elsewhere.
les
For
startups
example, in
évidemment
Scandinavia,
pour
that's
qu'elles lèvent des fonds parce que
problematic
elles manquent de
for
visibilité.
startups who are trying to
Et on a vu un
raise
move qui
funding.
est
There's a
intéressant, mais je
lack
suis pas sûr qu'il
of
soit très sain, de
transparency.
startups qui maintenant vont sur les marchés
There's a tendency now for
intraday, parce que
startups
finalement, là où on peut
to
faire le plus
look at
d'argent, c'est sur
intraday
la spéculation. Et
markets
c'est dommage parce que au départ,
where the
c'est pas
most
un
money can be
mécanisme qui est là
made
pour spéculer. Il est
via
là pour
speculation. The
réguler,
mechanism is
pour
not
offrir
actually there for
une
speculation. The
alternative
idea is
complémentaire, j'ai envie
rather
de dire,
that
à
there should
ces
be an
actifs
alternative, a
distribués, aux
complement, so to
actifs
speak,
de production
to
renouvelable, dont on sait qu'ils sont
the
pas très
kind of
prévisibles et
other
surtout pas
activities that
pilotables.
are underway.
Et donc,
And in
ça,
particular,
c'est
I'm
un petit peu
thinking
dommage. On voit
about
un
the
move
fact that
vers
you can't
la
control what's happening
spéculation
with
parce que c'est là
renewables, and it's
où il y a
tricky
de
to
l'argent
dispatch them. The
à
dispatching
faire.
side of things is problematic, so there's a lot of
Voilà.
headway to be made on that.
Ce qui est évidemment largement, on va dire,
Well, yes.
regrettable en la
What's
matière.
regrettable
Ce que vous regardez aussi,
is exactly what you've
d'autres
just
questions
said
à
now.
poser sur ces
I've
sujets.
got
Quand
some
on
other
parle de
questions on this topic as
flexibilité,
well. We're
il y
talking
a la
about
problématique aussi
flexibility.
du
There's
stockage.
also
Du
the issue
stockage
of
stationnaire, c'est
storage,
un enjeu majeur. C'est
stationary
peut-être un
storage,
point
which is a key
à
issue.
mettre en avant parce qu'on voit qu'il y a
That's
encore
something else that we
beaucoup
need
à
to
faire
put
en
in
la
the
matière.
limelight. A lot of
C'est vrai.
work to be done on
Et
that
c'est
as
assez
well.
nouveau.
Yes, that's actually quite
Et j'ai
new.
tendance à râler tout le temps. Mais là, pour une fois, le malheur des uns pourrait peut-être faire le bonheur des autres. C'est-à-dire
And of
que
course, some
on
people
a
might be
vu que
unhappy
les
about
voitures
that, but it
électriques
might
ont un
make
petit peu plus
others
de mal
happy.
à se
For example,
déployer, notamment en
electrical
Europe,
vehicles are having
que
more
ce
trouble
qu'on espérait.
getting going
Ce qui veut
than
dire
we
qu'il
had
y a pas mal
hoped
de
in
batteries
Europe, which means that there's a
qui peuvent
fair
être utilisées, alors
number
qui sont
of
produites très
batteries
largement en Chine
that have been
aujourd'hui,
produced largely in
mais qui
China
peuvent être
nowadays, as a
utilisées
matter of
contre du
fact, that
stockage
could be
stationnaire, ce qui
used
n'est pas
for stationary
leur,
storage. That's not
leur
what they were
objectif premier, qui est
originally
des batteries assez denses. Mais
produced
malgré
for.
tout, on
They're
a des
surplus
batteries, alors
batteries,
LFP pour la chimie en particulier,
and
qui
that can be
fonctionnent très
important
bien pour
for
du
the
stockage
chemical
stationnaire,
industry,
donc
for
qui
example. They
possèdent
work very
100%,
well
et on se retrouve
for stationary
à finalement
storage.
avoir une offre de stockage
So that means that
électrochimique qui est assez
electrochemical
intéressante.
Storage capacity is quite widely available. That can be useful for load shifting.
Sur la fréquence. Il y a 1001 services qu'une batterie peut
in
rendre
interacting in
au
terms
réseau.
of frequency, there's all kinds of things that batteries can do when interacting with the grid.
Je rebondis sur la question des PPA.
Coming back to the question of PPAs as well. Very often people lament the price and say the PPAs aren't as high a level as they could be. Of course, they're limited in terms of the time slots where energy is offered, and there's something which is quite interesting now. You have the batteries, and they're often linked up to solar energy producers, and that means that then it's possible to produce on demand. It's dispatchable. You can produce day and night as a function of this. And there's something that is missing, though. There's a lack of visibility that I have to complain about when it comes to the longer term. Picking up on what Mr. Malheur said earlier, the question of funding is very much linked to the framework in the medium and long term. I used to work in banking. You need to know how much this battery is going to produce in terms of revenue over the next 10 to 15 years. And that's why there are very few banks that can currently fund that kind of time frame for batteries, especially on a larger scale. But that's a great shame, because that's one of the obstacles we need to overcome. It's somewhat getting in the way of rollout of that battery technology. You touched upon a number of different points, and Corinne and Anna could respond on that, but I'd like to pass the floor back now to Erika Mink to comment on the tools we've been talking about. Are you looking at these tools? In ThyssenKrupp Steel, people talk a lot about flexibility. It might not be easy for everybody. For example, on the industrial front, it's not easy to draw on and tap into those kinds of tools, is it?
Ja, darf ich direkt reagieren?
Yes, can I respond straight away to that?
Dankeschön.
Yes, go
Dankeschön.
ahead.
Ja, danke,
Thank
Olivier,
you.
für die Frage.
And thank you for the question.
Das Thema
The issue
Flexibilität, das
of
uns umtreibt.
flexibility is, of course,
Und wir haben
a major issue.
also intern angesichts unserer Transformation und dieser massiven
In-house,
Bedarfsanstiege, die ich vorher erwähnt
because
habe,
of the
haben wir jetzt
transformation
intern
process underway
Projekt seit einiger
and the
Zeit, wo wir
enormous
uns
increase
sehr
in
genau
demand
gucken,
as well.
wo können wir
We've got a
flexibel sein
project
und was
that's trying
heißt
to determine where we can be
Flexibilität für uns.
flexible and precisely what flexible signifies for us.
Als großes integriertes Stahlwerk, wir haben so etwa
As a large
100
integrated
energieintensive
steelworks, we've got
Aggregate,
around
die alle
about 100
aufeinander
energy
eingespielt sind, und wir brauchen
intensive
ganz grundsätzlich, wir brauchen eine
machine
Basis
sets,
und wir
and they're all
brauchen eine kontinuierliche
interlinked, and we
Produktion. Wir
need
haben eine
continuous
kontinuierliche Produktion.
production.
Wo wir Flexibilitäten haben, ist, wir können
There is
Wartungsintervalle
flexibility in
legen.
terms of
Sowas
maintenance
können wir
periods. That
flexibel
can
sein,
be,
das können
as
wir
just said, we
entsprechend
can play with that, and we can have
planen. Aber
the
bei
relevant planning for that. But when you look at our actual major energy intensive processes,
ist die Flexibilität da
there's actually
begrenzt,
very
wenn in
little
geringen
wriggle
Maße.
room. There's not much
10%
flexibility.
hoch,
10% maybe
können wir an der Auslast drehen, aber
in
wenig.
terms of the
Deshalb ist, wie
load
gesagt,
can
für uns ist
either
eine
up or down, in
Basislast
fact,
ganz
but that's
wichtig.
about it. So a
Und wenn
base
wir
load
dann
is very
Richtung
important for
PPAs
us.
gucken, haben wir
Looking
festgestellt,
to
dass die auch gar nicht
PPAs,
so
we've
billig
seen
sind. Ja,
that
also
they're
wir
not
haben
actually
ein
so cheap
PPA,
after all. We do have a
ist
PPA.
auch, haben wir auch kommuniziert, im Februar letzten Jahres abgeschlossen,
Last
zusammen
February, we
mit
concluded that,
RWE über eine
and it's with
Liefermenge von
RWE,
110 Gigawattstunden pro Jahr. Das ist
110
aber natürlich, können
gigawatt
Sie sich
hours
vorstellen,
per
sehr
year is
kleinen,
the quantity. But that's
einstelligen
actually just a
Prozentsatz
drop
Bereich
in the ocean,
unseres
around about
Gesamtbedarfs, den
1%
wir
of
bis
our
2030
overall
haben.
need
Und da ist
up
eben auch
to
so, wir haben
2030.
Interesse an Baseload PPAs,
So we're interested in
um eine
baseload
konstante
PPAs
Versorgung zu
to
kriegen. Die
ensure
gibt es aber weniger, die
constant
sind sehr seltener
supply, but there's
und auch
not many
noch teurer als
of
die
those, and
klassischen
they're in fact
PPAs,
even
wo
more
man eben dann
expensive than the classic
die Abnahme
PPAs,
dem Erzeugerprofil anpassen muss, was eben
where takeoff has to be
bei unserem
adjusted to the
Anlagen komplett
producer
schwierig
profile,
ist.
which with
Und
our
der dritte Punkt ist
manufacturing
eben
concept,
auch,
that's
dass natürlich
problematic. And then the
die
next
Rolle
point is that, of course, PPAs are offered on a competitive basis. And there are certainly some sectors, think of the IT sector, for example, think of Amazon, Google, and all the rest of them. They have
als wir in der Stahlindustrie,
a great deal more capacity to pay up than we do in the steel industry. So we think that it's an appropriate instrument. It's the right way to go. But as matters currently stand, financially, they're very expensive for us. And I have to say as well, and refer back once again to the Draghi report, there are PPAs in which there's investment through contracts for difference.
einen kleineren Anteil zur Verfügung stellt für die energieintensiven Industrien dann
pool should be available there for the energy-intensive industries at preferential rates, cheaper ones, in other words. That's an interesting idea. I think that's an appropriate proposal to give preferential treatment to the energy-intensive industries, because we want to have secure economic production. We want to keep value added in Europe, and that means we need to see how we can keep everybody happy and come up together with solutions.
Questions are beginning to come in from the audience now. I'm reading them on one side and I'm about to put them. But we're talking about European competitiveness, and there are comparisons with what's happening in the United States. And I will be asking this question, but I wanted to ask another question to Anna Amaral-Burghi. You were talking about capacity markets and capacity mechanisms, something else that was raised as an important point. In your eyes, what role can they play? What can we learn for the German model?
Spielt auf jeden Fall eine sehr wichtige
Certainly
Rolle.
plays a very important part. We've heard a lot today about high prices, but we really need to think, and we've seen as well, that the more renewable energy is in the system, the more we have periods of low price. For the year 2023, 80% of hours in the year had a price per hour lower than 5 euros. And so we have to think of solutions. We need to think about situations that can arise, short-term situation, where the prices are either very high or very low, or we have no sun or wind. These are situations that we need to come up with solutions for. And here, a capacity mechanism is very important to guarantee that security of supply. For us as a TSO, this means having available dispatchable energy from power stations in the right place, which means that the system stability can always be guaranteed. At the moment in Germany, we're talking about the power station strategy, which was mentioned in the other sessions, and we can see this as an important step, which we hope will take place in Germany as quickly as possible, so that following that, we can develop a capacity market in Germany. But as a TSO, we think a central model with a local component is a good solution to ensure this future stability or security. Let me come in there because we've had a question come in for you, Anna Burghi. We're also going to be talking about storage. We have big storage batteries that Olivier was talking about just now, can help to contribute to stability of the system. What do you think the challenges are? Do you have an estimate of the capacity that might be allocated in Transnet zone? Sorry, your geographical area. Yes, that's interesting. We talked about flexibility today, and we saw that from different points of view. From the market perspective, we've heard that we talk about how a battery can serve the market. And from Mink, we've heard about types of flexibility in the process, which are important. For us, as an operator, when we see the system, when we have to operate a system, flexibility and the battery approach is important if they fit into the system. And if we make a bridge from there to design, it would be important to have incentives so that these batteries can serve the system with flexibility. So batteries, I'm sure, in the future are going to be important. Dispatchable power from power stations will nevertheless be important too, because the batteries are only available for a short period. And if we have one of these Dunkelflauters, other solutions such as power stations that can offer varied dispatchable quantities are important to the system.
Corina Grajewski, vous pouvez
Corina
réagir
Grajewski, you can probably react to that, especially on flexibility. I think that one objective for ENGIE is to quadruple its capacity for flexibility. And also a question on storage, a question that came for you from the audience, so I'm going to throw it in at this point as well. You have a number of renewable facilities in France and Germany. How do you think that you can resolve the problem of internal competition between the renewable energies? Cannibalization through pricing, for example, and what is the role of battery storage in that arena? Oh, thank you for those questions, which are very relevant. Perhaps to begin, I'll say something about the capacity mechanisms, because I can only confirm that from ENGIE's point of view, it's essential to have capacity mechanisms. And they need to be regarded as an integral part of the market design. Often they are seen rather as, I could be so bold as to say, in Germany, something we'd rather not have, something that's problematic. But I think at European level, we can observe in more and more countries that these mechanisms exist and function. They are absolutely essential, especially in relation to supply security, but also for flexibility, because you can reward flexible capacity, dispatchable capacity. And there I'm okay, there are gas-fired power stations too. And in terms of storage and batteries, we have experienced or tried to work with battery projects, for example, in Europe, in conjunction with capacity mechanisms. So the idea there is to set up mechanisms that cover all the technologies and everything relating to storage and flexibility. It works and it's indispensable. Flexibility is also a need which, as the question from the audience suggests, very important in the use of renewable energies. And I think it was very important what we heard about combined projects. For example, solar plus battery. That interests us as well at ENGIE. And we're working on projects of this kind in Europe, but also in the United States. It has to be said that, as so often, we'll see what happens in future. that in recent years we've seen that there were a lot of renewable plus battery projects of high volume set up very quickly, and there's a lot of interest in investing in this, a lot more in Europe, certainly. But we can also sense this hesitation, whether it's local or national. But we really believe that we need to push this kind of technology because I'll stop there, but these technologies, as we saw in our recent study, our decarbonization scenario for Europe for 2050, we saw that for our 2030 targets in Europe, we are, and that's almost tomorrow, and we can get there, but for 2050, and some
comme des technologies de stockage ne sont
for
pas
2050, with regard to batteries, our technologies aren't really developed as fast as we need them to be. Olivier, you were talking just now about that problem of storage and the lack of deployment. Perhaps you could say something about what's been said by the other speakers. And I wanted to open a new aspect here so we can go around the table again and try to better understand what the lever might be for pushing this further. We've just mentioned the United States, and we have a question from the audience. We often hear about the IRA and competitiveness with America. What is happening in Europe? Are there other factors, apart from prices, that are more advantageous in Europe than in the United States? Well, I'm very happy to answer that question about associating batteries, especially with solar, because it's amazing. And it's a response to, perhaps I'm generalizing a bit here, to the weakness of the DSOs. In the United States, they have some very elderly ones in poor condition, even in California. It's not rare to have blackouts and no longer to have electricity in the home, whereas in Europe, perhaps I'm taking a rather French view of this, but it never happens. We're lucky that we have these very robust systems, thanks to the TSOs doing their work properly. And I wanted to come back to that because it's important. We can't expect the TSOs to provide everything and security. But maybe that's what's missing in the United States. But we have this problem, and people who are happy to invest in these batteries in the United States because they want backup at home, either they're big fleets, and it's a response to a vulnerability which is not only American, but much bigger in the US. When you can be cut off from the grid, and if you're going to build a new solar park, you can wait 18 months before you get a connection. So it's quite important. There's an interest in building a fleet of batteries at the same time. I wanted to bring this into the equation because it's a response to local vulnerabilities. And again, for the private consumer, pricing of these things is difficult, is different in the United States compared with Europe. But if you've got storage batteries, you've got different options, more flexible options, and perhaps permitting is a bit of an issue. We've been talking about that. But there's going to be a supplementary cost relates to subsidies, and that's something for governments. But it also slows us down. Okay, so this is the last time I'll be going around the table. We've listened to different points of view about what's at stake, prices, storage, flexibility, capacity mechanisms. the role that can be played by the networks. But we've been talking about this trilemma in the energy sector. We need to protect the environment, we need security of supply, we want cost efficiency. So how do you envisage the design in achieving this wonderful equilibrium? Erika, perhaps you want to respond first. We can take some questions afterwards from the audience, but I'm going to give everyone an opportunity to respond to this question. Let's begin with Erika.
Ja, also ich denke wirklich, es ist wichtig, dass man,
Yes, I think it's really important that if you look at the electricity market design, we need European solutions, and they need to work across Europe. They need to be standards for Europe. We have our energy-intensive industries. We want a reliable price, and there I think once we have that, I think we can be competitive with the rest of the world. But we've got different rules in different countries at the moment, and I think it's important to have standard rules, at least a level playing field. I mentioned hydrogen before, and indirectly, this generates a demand for electricity. And that worried us a great deal in terms of supply security. We've also seen that the generation, the hydrogen ramp up, the energy transformation, the industrial transformation, all these things happening at the same time, but on different pathways. And someone mentioned this before. We're working with assumptions that aren't necessarily always realistic. So I think it's important that we take an integrated approach and see electricity as part of an energy system, and then think about what do we need to expand, in what form, and how can we adjust the existing regulations. We see, for example, and this is an issue for us, the hierarchy with blue and green and other hydrogen colors, quite simple things where we need to look at the regulations again and see what would help to encourage investment. It's all well-intentioned regulation, but in fact, it's been acting as a brake on investment. If I think about the various delegated acts in Brussels, everything that is low carbon or carbon free, all these sources need to be taken into account in the system. And I think from an industrial perspective, that would be important. We need lots of different sources of energy. How can we put all this together, and how can we develop synergies in order to achieve cost efficiency in our solutions? And thinking about America, we like to compare ourselves with America as well. In the United States, we tend to think everything's better. But I think one point that really is better is that they have much simpler, it's been mentioned, planning procedures for new facilities, for subsidies. I think in Europe, we need to catch up quite a lot on those fronts and make faster decisions and have more certain frameworks for investment. Thank you. So the same question to Anna Borghi. How do you see the design of the electricity market in terms of achieving that balance I described?
I think the
market design that we've been constructing in the EU in the last years, with the reform recently and all the points that we are trying to achieve, like flexibility and capacity mechanisms, this market design serves as a very sound basis for a successful energy transition. What's important from our point of view, and I hope that all my colleagues will support me in that, is that we need stable framework conditions, not only for us, as an electricity TSO, but also in generating confidence for investment in industry and in renewables. And something that's important, a condition we certainly need, is that the bidding zone design
im Moment sind. Wenn wir über Marktdesign auch
if we're talking
sprechen
about
und
market design
Dreieck Versorgungssicherheit,
and
Umwelt,
this triangle, this trilemma
ich denke, es ist auch
of
wichtig,
protecting the climate, incentivizing investment and securitizing supply with cost efficiency,
Energiesystem in Europa für die Welt.
and
Das ist eine
the energy
einzigartige
system in Europe is actually an example for the world. We have a unique system here.
gebundenes System, sehr viele Länder, die zusammenarbeiten, Versorgungssicherheit
An
zu
interrelated
gewährleisten,
system. A lot of countries are working on achieving prosperity for Europe through secure supply. And I think it's a fantastic example for how we can work together on highly complex issues like market design for energy systems. And we shouldn't take that for granted. For us as a TSO, it means working day by day with the other 26 countries, and it works. We're doing the best we can to make sure it does work. So I wanted to highlight that. It's a very good example for how we can achieve prosperity for Europe and peace in Europe. That's important to emphasize when comparing with the United States and other places. We've had a question here from the audience that I'd like to put to Anna Borghi, but also to two other speakers in a moment. It relates to artificial intelligence. We've talked a lot about the data center consumption. They're going to require more energy. What role might AI play in improving the security of supply and the efficiency of the electricity market? Is this something that you are looking at, Anna Borghi?
In der Tat, das ist ein Thema,
Yes, indeed. It is an issue that we are monitoring. At the moment, at least at Transnet BW, there aren't any examples I can give you at the moment, but it's part of our digitization strategy, not only for us at Transnet BW, but for many other players in the energy market as well, in order to generate efficiencies. And I'm sure that given the data volumes that we have to process, this is going to be a solution for a lot of the tools that we're working on.
Corinna Grajewski,
I'm sure you also have an answer for this question about artificial intelligence, and more generally, because I'm going around the table one last time, your idea of the concept for the energy market design. We've certainly seen that Europe needs to congratulate itself, at least on this point. Yes, and I certainly agree with that. That's true, that our single market for energy is a really precious thing. We should be proud of it, and we need to keep it. So anything that might intervene in the market simply at national level is to the detriment of our single market and what we've achieved with that. So in general, in our view, the energy transition must take place at European level. We really have to bear in mind how we can optimize this system even more by integrating even more of the market, working on the interconnections, as I mentioned at the start, and indeed, I would say one thing that we can learn from the United States a little about these two elements is the pragmatism and the speed. And what Erika was saying about hydrogen and the very difficult discussions we had about green and other colors of hydrogen, a bit more pragmatism in the European debate would be useful, so that we don't end up staking different technologies against each other, but can actually draw on all the vectors we have available and can use them for what they can do best, where they are most efficient. If we take electrification, which is extremely important and is stagnant at the moment, which really needs to be reactivated, dynamized in Europe at the moment. It's very important as well for industrial processes and low temperature heating. We know that there are processes at high temperature as well in industry where we need molecules, decarbonized molecules, okay. But we must always bear in mind all of these things. We have electrons, we have molecules. There's a bit of an alliance there between electrons and molecules, which might be the DNA of industry. But we need to have a holistic view of the energy system in Europe, and we need to think in an integrated manner, integrate the different sectors, the different technologies, all the vectors that can assist with decarbonization, and add a little dose of speed and pragmatism. And when we do that, I am extremely optimistic that we will achieve our goals, not only for the climate, but also in strengthening the competitiveness of European industry, where we are expecting to see a major initiative on the Clean Industrial Deal from the European Commission. We can do both, optimizing costs wherever possible, and there are plenty of options.
And the last word perhaps on AI. Yes, I do believe that it's very important. And unfortunately, I don't have any concrete examples to give you here, but we are also working on a day-to-day basis with artificial intelligence at NG, and it's an increasingly important role in the networks, but also in order to optimize the market, i.e. the trading of energy as such, because it is already very digitalized, and the artificial intelligence can be used in order to optimize also system costs. So, and I would now like to hand the floor to Olivier Varnon to answer this question in this last round of table, the role about AI. Yes, indeed, because it's been years that we've been witnessing technologies emerging based on AI, but the artificial intelligence that we know or have known for the last 10 years is working. Now, when it comes to the generative AI, I'm not quite sure what its role would be for the balancing of networks. I think the obstacle is much more in terms of access to data and the quality of data. And I'm coming back to the management of grids. I think the distribution operators are much more digitalized than the colleagues in low and medium voltage. And and these networks were built with the idea that electricity only flows in one direction. And unfortunately for them, it's actually flowing in all directions. It's being stored in batteries, it's redistributed in the network. And it is a nightmare really for networks that are only or hardly digitalized. That is why the operators of networks have very few real-time informations. And unfortunately, in France, we do have these. In France, we do have meters that provide information, but it's not granular enough in order to be used. So that's really something that's missing, that's lacking, in order to really fully tap the potential of AI. AI is actually the ideal tool in order to deal with problems that are too complex for the human brain, but that would be, frankly, easy for AI. So we have an access problem to data and quality problem to data. And it's at the end of the day, it's really the problem that the consumer doesn't want to share their data. They don't know exactly what we're going to do with it, and they're reluctant or hesitant. But I do believe that progressively we will improve the situation, and it will allow us to develop in leaps and bounds, really. And the investment in copper and transformers that are important, and in France, it's certainly the case that there will be a lot that has to be put into the soil there. But I do believe that in France, we will achieve a lot of cost savings also on the back of AI. So that's it. Thank you very much. We could have, of course, gone on for quite a while, but I do believe that you've underlined the important and most salient points, and certainly you all agree that it is important to have a European perspective, and there are things that need to be evolved, but there is cooperation that is taking place, in particular Franco-German cooperation. So this is an excellent example that you provided here at this roundtable. Thank you to all of you for participating in this Franco-German Forum on Energy. So we're coming to the end of this day of debates, and we will now broaden the spectrum a bit. We will welcome Robert Vauteur of the IPCC, and but before that, Carsten Neuhoff, thank you for joining us. You're head of the Climate Policy Department at the German Institute for Economic Research. Thank you for joining us. And you have the floor for a first summary of today's proceedings. Thank you. Thank you very much for this invitation. It was a very interesting day indeed, and I'll try to summarize a bit along the three energy political axes that are being debated. First of all, affordability, and that was traditionally the aim, and in the heating crisis, we also saw that the reliability of supply is also an issue, and Sophie Morlon at the beginning stressed that the industry is not looking at current prices, but also predictability of prices in coming years. And it's becoming more and more important. And you need hedging contracts in order to have stability and a clear prospect there. And if companies have certainty, then they can deal with volatility in the spot market and can use their flexibility at the market. And in that sense, flexibility is also very broadly defined. It's not just about batteries. We have heat storage for heating purposes, but also process heating, and or electric vehicles who could be used in a flexible way for storage purpose. On the other side, in Germany, Philipp Nimmermann stressed that all market participants profit, not only individually, but as a system from the flexibility. The challenges that we need to face is how industry companies can be supported in adopting flexibility and adopt these new situations, this transition aspect. Laurent Cuny, from a French perspective, stressed that mid-sized companies, even if they're power intensive, they need to have access to hedging. And in France, there's a new program being set up in order to have a 5-year insurance in that sense. And Ms. Melstock from the European Commission also stressed this. We have a strong emphasis on long-term security in the European market reform. That is what we need, and this gas crisis was a huge crisis. And CFDs. CFDs are also a very, very strong message in that sense. My preference are the contracts for difference that can actually be handed over also in a pool. So that means large volumes of renewable energies can be obtained at stable prices, which is a very important framework also for investments and a quick enhancement of renewable energies. And then the political development traditionally has been emphasized to obtain a clean system, but now energies, but now we need a clean system as such. Starting point was that in Germany, thanks to the European framework, it was possible to install 15 gigawatt of renewable energies in last year, and it was actually only solely in terms of wind energy, 15 gigawatt. And now it is about waking the sleeping beauty of flexibility, as he named it, because flexibility is like a time machine with which excessive power produced by wind and solar can be transferred to other areas and then be used to save fossil fuels in times when there's a low production. So, and in so doing, we can reduce the dependence on prices and reduce the dependence on imports that we still have from Russia of natural gas. So, to wrap it up, André Poschmann mentioned Article 19C of the electricity regulation, where all of the countries are tasked to look at the hurdles and how to do away with them. I think the elephant in the room, and I think Ms. Bogi just briefly touched upon it, is how do we deal with a system where we want to have more flexibility in terms of demand and introduce that to the market. Then in southern Germany, for example, we have a lot of sun and the price will then increase. And then we will be filling the storage systems in the north, and that might add to bottlenecks. So if we want flexibility, we need a local price signal. So a single tariff, a single price for the entire region is no longer possible. When it comes to the operation of the system, you can secure it in such a way that it can operate with a single price. But we need to tackle this elephant in the room to have local prices. And the third dimension is supply security. We saw during the gas and heating crisis that it is really about the resilience of the entire system, not just about sufficient generation capacity. And throughout the day, we've seen that it's still quite a vivid memory of this crisis, and also fears that exist also around Baltic connectors. And the German-French press release was really about flexibility as a key in order to have a resilient system. André Gröbel from the Federal Network Agency stressed how important the synergies of the national systems are. We are part of the European network because we have a lot of advantages, and we can also implement a resource adequacy. And Ivan Foschow reflected that. He said we would not have mastered this crisis if we hadn't stood together there and acted jointly. I think this is also a very important conclusion. So what is the challenge for supply security? If we want to obtain more and more flexibility, we can have a day-night balancing. This Dunkelflaute, as it is known, is perhaps a very good example. 100 to 200 hours a year. What happens in these critical times? Do we have enough resilience in the system? That is the question. And in that context, a question that is upmost on my mind, we have strategic reserves, oil reserves for such a situation. We have a strategic reserve also in the German electricity system that has helped us during the crisis, also when the French nuclear power stations. And why can't we enhance and extend the system to the European so that we have reserve utilities who then come into the market and support the market at a predetermined price? And I would plead to, when it comes to these market discussions, to think about a security reserve or a strategic reserve in that sense. And as a very last point, allow me to mention that at the end of the day, the energy political triangle has been extended with the transformation issue. It came up time and again. What are the pathways for the enhancement of renewables? What are the pathways for flexibility? And I believe that this is a privilege that we enjoy in Europe, and that we have that we obtain stability through such pathways. We saw that with the renewable objectives 2022 and 2017, 2018. Nobody believed that they could be achieved. Obviously, with the prescient and wise measures, it was possible to set up this capacity. And with this topic today, I think we should continue along those veins, also when it comes to flexibility and stability, so that we can, at the end of the day, continue to develop energy supply in a cost-effective and effective way. Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Kasteneuhoff, for providing this summary of today's proceedings. So you're the head of the Climate Policy Department at the German Institute for Economic Research. And to wrap it all up, we will, as a final point in this forum, we will hand the floor to Robert Votard.
Who's the chair of Working Group 1 of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So thank you for taking part in this forum. And let me hand over to you to wind up today's meeting. Well, thank you. And thank you for giving me this opportunity to provide you some insights from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change.
Personnellement, je suis climatologue, donc physicien, et
I'm a
donc je
climate
suis
scientist.
Aujourd'hui en charge de ce qu'on appelle le groupe 1 du GIEC, c'est-à-dire
now in charge of the working group 1
du climat. Oui, merci s'il vous plaît
of the IPCC.
La planche suivante.
Please let's keep the following slide on the screen. So Group 1 of the IPCC takes stock of the physical science of the climate.
En ce qui concerne le changement climatique, d'après l'ensemble de la littérature scientifique, et puis
it draws on all of the scientific literature available on the topic and draws up reports and other deliverables to feed into international public policy in this field. So decisions in the IPCC are taken by consensus as a scientific consensus, and that comes from analyzing a panoply of different studies. And subsequently, a summary is drawn up for decision makers. It's also produced in a consensus with representatives from the governments who are part of the IPCC. To date, the IPCC has provided input to key steps in the Climate Convention's development and has helped to move ahead on decarbonization and work aimed at mitigating climate change. The most recent was the 6th assessment report that fed into the first global stocktake last year at COP28. So, what you can see here is an overview of all the reports produced during the 6th cycle. We've moved into the 7th cycle since the start of last year, and we're preparing new reports now. I'd like to just cite a few findings. There's a whole host more. One of the main outcomes is that climate change changes in temperature are entirely due to human activity. If you look at the global figures, and if you look at the various different regions of the world, we can now demonstrate that in each global region there's a very clear signal of climate change. For example, on the top left, you can see WCA, Western and Central Europe, WCE, you can see heat waves. This is red to show there's been an increase in heat waves, and we can now demonstrate that that increase in heat waves is very pronounced, by the way, and very striking in Western Europe, is also due to climate change. And this phenomenon will continue. The same applies to other phenomena. For example, torrential rain and extreme events related to heavy precipitation. And then there's also drought. The colouring is not so pronounced in these slides because when this report was submitted in 2021, there was a lack of regional reports to fill in the entire picture. What we now know, though, is that for drought, for example, there are regions in Europe that will be affected, and that's right across the south of Europe, and these droughts will also have a knock-on effect on the world of energy. That's not just in Southern Europe, but also in the United States to the west thereof, of North America. So we've got sufficient studies on that to demonstrate this scientifically. Now, one of the results of the most recent cycle was to show how, on the basis of public policy, which has already been implemented, how on that basis we're likely to see emissions developing. So we're looking at CO2 and CO2 equivalents, which is on red between 2010 and 2050. So that's the red line that's plotted there. This is the trend from implemented policies. On the one hand, that's already made it possible for us to avoid the highest figures for the highest potential scenarios. That's quite remarkable. So public policy has had an effect already and has avoided a number of gigatons of CO2 emissions. However, it is by no manner of means enough. There's a big gap. We're seeing stabilization of CO2 emissions. However, we should actually be heading towards zero, towards neutralization of CO2 emissions, which is what would be happening with that blue line on the graph. That would help us to limit warming to 1.5 degrees C. So there are some positive aspects on public policy, but a great deal still to be done. What we see looking ahead, I'll come back to energy when talking about Europe later. So what we see are unprecedented events that have never been seen in the course of history. That's very important to grasp. On the left, for example, you see maximum annual temperature, British Columbia. And the maximum temperature since 1950 up to 2021, at which point there was an unprecedented heat wave. And records have been beaten by 5 degrees in this region. Generally, when a record is broken, it's a 1 degree overshoot, maybe 2 degrees, but here it was so pronounced. The records were being broken by an enormous margin. And we should need to explain this in greater detail in our future reports. We know that this is directly linked to climate change. Here you can see figures for the wildfires in Canada as well, a similar phenomenon there. And then on the right, you can see the most recent temperature developments. 2024 is the first year above 1.5 degrees C on average. We can see the direction we're moving in. It's a very clear signal that's being sent out there.
On s'approche de la limite de la limite espérée qui figure dans les accords de Paris et
Globally,
nous la
we're
dépasserons
reaching
en fait
the
très
limit
probablement
that's
parce qu'au rythme actuel,
spelled out in the
les températures se
Paris
réchauffent
Agreement
de
and the rate that we're going at.
environ 2 dixièmes à 3 dixièmes de degrés par décennie.
We see
Comme nous sommes
0.2 to
aujourd'hui
0.3
à
of
un
a degree
réchauffement
increase
à peu
per
près de 1,3
decade.
pour arriver
Now
à
we see an
1,5
increase of about
il y a moins d'une
1.3.
décennie. Donc on s'attend
Previously,
à
now we're about
dépasser
1.5 in less than a decade, so we've probably
d'ici une
crossed
dizaine d'années.
this
Je
decade,
vais
and this
passer
threshold will have
à la planche
crossed that
suivante.
threshold
Voilà,
permanently
pour dire
in the next
maintenant, toute
decade.
la question va être de savoir
The
qu'est-ce
whole
qu'il se
point then will
passe
be
après ce 1,5 degré. Si on le franchit, ce qui est probable,
what
ou très
happens
probable,
after the
il
1.5
va
degrees
falloir
C. If we
contenir
cross
néanmoins les
that level,
émissions
what will
à des
happen? We'll
niveaux
need to
raisonnables, c'est-à-dire
keep
normalement bien en dessous
emissions
de
at
2
a reasonable
degrés.
level
Et
so
pour cela, des
that we
différents
hit
scénarios
temperature increases
envisagent
well
par
below
exemple
2
des
degrees C. There's
scénarios
various
qu'on appelle
different
d'overshoot. Ça va être un
potential
gros sujet
climate
dans
outcomes.
les
There's
années qui
overshoot
viennent,
that will be high on the
même
agenda
si
in years to come.
ça fait encore aujourd'hui beaucoup débat.
At
Donc c'est
present, there's a lot
des
of debate
scénarios où on
on this.
dépasse les
There are
1,5
scenarios
degré et on
where there's
redescend un petit
an
peu
overshoot
après.
of the
Après, il va
1.5 degrees
falloir
C and then
faire attention à ne pas
emissions
trop
taper
rêver
off. We need
sur ce type
to
de
be sure that we're
scénario
not dreaming about this
parce
kind of
qu'on ne pourra
scenario.
au mieux, dans le
This is not
meilleur des
just
cas,
wishful thinking. In the best
que
case scenario,
redescendre de 1 ou 2 dixièmes de degré
we'll only be able to go down by 1
via
to
un
2
ensemble
tenths of a
d'événements.
degree
Je vais passer à la planche suivante.
for a whole
Un
host of different
autre
reasons.
gros sujet qui va arriver, ce
There's
sont les
another
points de
major
bascule, bien
topic, and
sûr.
that's the tipping points, of course.
Arrive-t-on dans des domaines où
Are we moving
certains systèmes
into
ou sous-systèmes du
a
système
range
Terre
where certain subsystems of the terrestrial
franchir des
system
points de non-retour
may
ou des
cross
points
points of no
où le système
return,
s'organise différemment
points where the system will start to function
ou conduise
differently,
à des pertes d'espèces. Donc
or there'll be loss of species, for
il y a
example.
beaucoup de littérature aujourd'hui qui
There's a great deal of
identifie
literature
ce type de
nowadays
risque
that
et il ne
identifies
faut,
precisely this kind of
comment
risk.
dire, même si aujourd'hui ils sont difficiles à qualifier en termes de risque, c'est parce que il y a peu
It's hard to
recul,
qualify this at present
de
because we
données.
have a lack
Ces
of
risques
data,
sont quand même néanmoins à prendre en compte
and we must bear these risks in mind,
pour tous les systèmes, y compris les systèmes
looking at all
énergétiques.
systems, including
Maintenant,
energy
avec la diapo
systems.
suivante, je vais dire quelques mots de l'Europe. Donc,
A few
alors,
words now
les
on
planches
Europe.
sont un peu resserrées, mais
They're
vous
printed
pourrez
fairly
voir
small,
sur le lien qui
but
est
if you look at the
indiqué en
link
haut à droite, donc le GIEC
on the top at the right, the
fournit également
IPCC
des produits un peu
also
dérivés. Là, ce sont des fiches de synthèse,
produces fact
qui
sheets, for
sont soit
example.
régionales, soit
They're
soit
either regional
sectorielles.
or
Là,
on a
je vous
sector-by-sector
montre
basis.
la fiche de
And
synthèse,
here
donc
I'm
la
showing
première
you
page de la fiche de
the
synthèse
first page
pour
of
l'Europe
the summary fact sheet
à
for
gauche
Europe
et pour le secteur de l'énergie à droite,
on the
avec
left and for
quelques
the energy
figures un peu
sector on the
différentes.
right, with some quite
Simplement
striking
pour dire
figures
finalement
and
en
illustrations,
Europe, ce
just
qui va
so
se
that you can
passer,
see what's going to be
c'est
happening
une augmentation des
in
températures,
Europe.
des
Temperatures
extrêmes
are
et de tous les
going
phénomènes liés aux
to go up,
températures,
and
une
all
élévation du
temperature
niveau des mers qui
phenomena
devrait
are
être
going to
supérieure.
become
Et en ce qui
more
concerne
extreme. Also,
les régimes
rising sea
de
levels
pluie, c'est
and
plus de pluie
precipitation,
au nord et moins de
more rain
pluie au
in the
sud.
north and
Donc,
less rain in
une
the south,
augmentation des déficits, en particulier dans les
an
régions
increase
méditerranéennes,
in
ce qui
droughts,
pose
particularly
un
in the
vrai problème
Mediterranean
pour
region.
les systèmes hydroélectriques.
And that's very problematic for
Voilà.
hydroelectric
Donc,
systems as well,
sinon,
for hydroelectric
ce qu'on peut
power.
dire aussi, c'est que quand on regarde dans le monde les figures qui sont à droite,
And if you
donc
look on
la
the
rangée
right
qui est au
at the
milieu et la
images there,
rangée qui est en bas,
there's one
la
line in the
rangée
middle
au milieu
and one right at the
montre en
bottom, the one in the
fonction
middle
du degré de réchauffement et du
shows you
scénario
various different
l'évolution
scenarios
des vents. Donc, ce sont des choses qui sont des évolutions qui ne sont pas
for
négligeables,
wind behavior
même
as a
si elles restent
function of
modérées.
temperature
Les
increases.
changements
The
dans les
changes
vents
in mean
d'ici la
wind
fin du
indicated
siècle
here from now until the
sont de
end of the
l'ordre
century. It's an order of
typiquement dans
magnitude
l'hémisphère nord d'une
in the
baisse
northern
des
hemisphere
vents
of
de
winds
l'ordre de
abating
quelques pourcents à 10%. Alors pour nous, c'est vrai que
by
ça nous paraît très peu,
various different percentages, up to 10% for climatologists. That's quite shocking. People have said, well, 10% could mean that you're really affecting the viability of an energy system. So 10% is a really significant figure and a high figure. So the image at the bottom, you can see the equivalent. Speaker, no, it's the other way around. The wind is down below and the droughts are up above. The conclusion is the same, though. At the top, you have the precipitation. For Europe, you can see, looking at that, there's a great shortfall in the Mediterranean region with increased precipitation in the north.
Voilà un peu. Alors ça, c'est pas directement issu du GIEC, c'est plutôt une
And this
étude
one's not directly from the IPCC. It's a study that we conducted. It's a little complex, country by country. You can see what could be expected in terms of 1.5 degree increase in temperature, 2 degrees, 3 degrees, and the impact this would have, for example, on wind power. So taking account of an implementation scenario with the renewables, there's a solar PV power scenario as well, a hydropower scenario, and then the last one is thermoelectric power, and that's irrespective of whether those are classic power stations or nuclear power stations. So generally there's a drop in production for wind power, a slight drop off in solar power. There's marked changes for hydropower in the south. There's a great shortcoming that's rather more advantageous to the north. You can see that the columns are going both below the central baseline and above it as well. The situation become worse in terms of production of electricity, because temperatures going up means that it's harder to keep power stations cooled to the appropriate temperature. So those are risks associated with investment in the energy sector in Europe. It's important to bear this in mind. Climate change also alters the situation for renewables. It changes their potential. And so that was the case for different kinds of energy sources. But there's also, of course, other risks as well. I cite two studies here. We mustn't believe that extreme events are simply going to signify an increase in temperature, and that will be that. It's much more than that. For example, it's been shown recently that if you have an extremely cold winter, such as the one in 1963, that's the year I was born, as a matter of fact, and that very extreme winter was one in which I'm sure people remember in Germany and in France, that was at the heart of this enormous wave of cold that swept right across Europe that winter, particularly in January. And it was that's something that can occur again with a lower probability. It could occur again even in a warming climate. We need to focus on these potential scenarios as well. At the end of the day, solidarity between European countries is so very important. That's really of the essence. Extreme conditions, even on a very large scale, might not affect the whole of Europe, and electrical production elsewhere could perhaps compensate for that. I'm not talking about the heat waves. I've talked about that before, and I'd like to wind up by saying the following. I don't have anything more to show you in terms of figures and charts. In Europe, in France, in Germany, we see that measures are underway for decarbonization. There are decarbonization levels aiming at net zero for 2050. And to date, we're sticking more or less correctly to the pathway, something I didn't imagine a decade ago. I didn't really believe that in Europe we'd manage to do that. So I'm really very pleased to see that actually happening in practice. I would, of course, hope that that continues up to 2050 as well. We've perhaps already harvested the low-hanging fruit. Things might become harder in the future. There will be a greater effort to make. But the future development of emissions is positive for Europe and hopeful for Europe, for France, for Germany. First and foremost, we are really spearheading decarbonization. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Robert Vautard, for giving us this scientific view, which helps to explain why our challenges are so important. And we can see what's shifting in Europe. We've seen allusions to competitiveness in Europe today and compared that with the United States. It's important to see that Europe still has a big role to play and to focus on the cooperation between Germany and France. So thank you so much. That brings us to the end of this forum. Thank you to all of you who have followed us. There were many of you. We were delighted to see. I'd particularly like to thank our interpreters because they've been working hard. We tried not to talk too fast. We tried not to use too many acronyms. But thank you to Nathalie Pijoulet, Bernd Sauer, Sebastian Weitemeyer, Helen Ferguson, Alexander Schmidt, and Kate Vanovich. I'd also like to thank Tune News, who's been in the background helping me to prepare for this forum. Thank you to Céline Piotti and to Sven Rosner for putting their confidence in me. Thank you to Christoph Körner and Valentin Elkner, who helped so much to implement all this and were passing the baton visually. There were those who looked after the slides. There was Estelle. I didn't have to do it. And I'd like to stress that all the presentations will be available online from the 4th of February, as will the recordings. I'd like to thank the partners because this was a collaboration between the German Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs and Climate Action, the French Ministry of the Economy, Finance and Industrial and Digital Sovereignty, the German Foreign Office, and of course the Franco-German Office for the Energy Transition. And I'm sure they're going to be continuing their work in the next few months. On the 11th of February, there'll be an event. There'll be the capacity market event later on, and the conference on wind energy on the 5th of March. It'll be my great pleasure to be hosting that conference as well, which will be coming back to negative prices. Then we have on the 19th of March a conference on decarbonization of heating. So there's a lot still to get through. All of this with the help of the Franco-German office. And of course, the 22nd of January is an important symbolic day. Let's hope that that symbolism continues to apply in binding France and Germany in friendship. I think I've mentioned almost everybody. I wish all of you a very pleasant evening.